Welcome everyone to EFA Talks, our monthly get-together with members and guests to talk about topics of concern in the digital rights space. I'm Rita Mack, Vice Chair of EFA, and your host for today's talk, Surveillance Capitalism, Tech for Evil. First, Electronic Frontiers Australia acknowledges and pays respect to the past, present and future traditional custodians and elders of this nation, and the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Thanks everyone for being here today. We value your support and interest. Things are also, and a big thanks to ThoughtWorks and of course Robin for your continuous support. We are now living in a world where law enforcement can impersonate us online, manipulate our data, and force takeovers of our digital accounts. The passing of the Surveillance Legislation Amendment, Identity and Disrupt Bill 2020 last Wednesday, weaponizes the use of an already existing powerful surveillance architecture into law, giving police and intelligence agencies unprecedented powers. So today we'll be talking about both surveillance capitalism and state surveillance and how that impacts your future. We will discuss the Identity and Disrupt Bill 2020 and what that means to our democracy. To talk to us about this, I would like to welcome our panelist, Manal al-Sharif, a leading voice on predatory surveillance and oppressive regimes. Manal is a Saudi human rights activist, cybersecurity expert, best-selling author, and one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. Her one-woman protest helped ignite the Women's Right to Drive campaign in Saudi Arabia in 2011. Her first book, Daring to Drive, My Life as an Accidental Activist in a Kingdom of Men, was published in 2017, and it is a compelling account of her experiences and insights, and she won the Good Reads Choice Award 2017. So inspired by the unfolding Arab Spring, Manal bravely challenges the argument posed by Saudi clerks that driving could damage women's ovaries. She co-founded and led the hashtag Women to Drive movement. She organized her own day of action, filming herself driving and then posting it on YouTube. Now, her stance cost her her job, her country, separation from her first son, and time spent in a cockroach-infested Saudi prison. So I absolutely welcome Manal. And also I'd like to welcome, of course, Angus Murray, founder of EFA Talks and EFA's Policy Committee Chair. He is a partner and trademarks attorney at Irish Bentley Lawyers, law lecturer and director, and member of many organisations, including Queensland Council for Civil Liberties, Legal Forecast, QLS Innovation Committee, and the IP and Technology Committee. Welcome, both of you, to this exciting talk today.
Thank you for the, my God, I didn't know you read the book, but thank you.
Yes, I did. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A because we were going to get to all your questions today. Now, we're actually just going to dive straight in. So, Manal, you've witnessed sort of really in a very short period of time how social media platforms went from a tool of liberty to a tool of oppression. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so today I'm off all social media accounts. And I had to do that in 2018 after I saw how Twitter being used effectively by the Saudi regime to propagate their it was completely disinformation. It was completely a propaganda for the government. And they had trolls to reach world trends on Twitter. On the day they announced they were responsible for the assassination of the Saudi journalist in Istanbul, Jamal Khashoggi. I knew that day we lost it to dictators. So social media, it was used in the past to give us voice. We people living in authoritarian regimes where you don't have a voice, there's only one voice, the government. Unfortunately, that was taken away from us. They understood the game, the game rules, and then now they're playing it in unfair ways. And the business models of most social media, when we started in 2011, it wasn't what you see today, that favors misinformation, favors filter bubbles, favors being sensationalized when you go and post and share. And that's just, we lost it to, people don't think anymore before they share. They just get their information through a few feeds here in Facebook or their Twitter. They get angry about it. They share without reading through it, without understanding. So we really lost it. And I see the harmful effect of social media today and how it's being used by populists. And Cambridge Analytica is a good example, but it's happening today. And that's why I decided to finally fight back and launch the Tech Forever. It was launched today.
Yeah.
So I announced about it here in this panel. And it's to really give us tools, first of all, to understand what these big tech are doing and fight back.
So when we talk about surveillance capitalism, Manal, how would you describe that to people?
So the one who coined this term was Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff. She has a whole book called Surveillance Capitalism. It's a 700 pages book. It's so big. There are some good summaries of the book that I highly recommend reading them or watch her. There is an extended interview with her. She coined that term, and she meant how capitalism today commodify the human experience. So our personal data, our lives is being commodified. And she mentioned that, she mentioned so many good statistics to prove this point of view, that we are living in an age of surveillance, continuous surveillance. And the worst part of this continuous surveillance is not about going online and sharing our information. It's about the information we did not share with these companies or tech companies or people who are collecting data about us. It's the way they have access to this massive amount of data that's being kept in few hands of these big tech. And those people have deep pockets to hire the best data scientists in the world. There are only 10,000 data scientists in the world. Most of them are hired by big tech. And they have time to write algorithms. Those algorithms use machine learning to understand, to being trained by our data, by our continuous engagement with this machine, and then predict our behavior. And that's what makes it really scary. It's not the information we share with this machine, it's the information that algorithms are actually creating about it, creating those very intimate profiles about us, and use that, weaponize that. And that's surveillance capitalism. It's that next step. We're using machine learning and artificial intelligence.
So who has access to your data, and how do they benefit from it?
There are so many parties who are very interested in having access to our data. If you start any big tech company that gives you a service for free, like Google and Facebook, they're the biggest offenders, I call them. They're the ones who collect as much data about us, and not only from the people who use these platforms, they go to data brokers and buy data from them. And I can explain data broker. Those big companies, Google, for example, used to take this data and use it to enhance their services. But they were pushed by they pushed by the shareholders to use this data, to monetize this data for hyper-targeted advertising. And Google is one of the largest. Google and Facebook are the two largest companies globally in digital advertising. They made $117 billion the last 6 months, Google, from digital advertising. So those are the people sitting on our data. We train their algorithm for free, but there are the data vampires, I call them, who are the data brokers. Data brokers are like vampires. They are in the dark. They suck our data from every single data entry point that we don't even know that they are using it. So anyone who is willing to sell them our data, they will go and buy it from them. And then they craft that amazing profile picture about us, and then they sell it back to advertisers. And they say, hey, we understand if you want to win the elections in this county, we have access to the voters' personalities, and we're going to tell you what type of information and messages to target your voters and win. That's how Cambridge Analytica did it. Unfortunately, people think Cambridge Analytica went bankrupt, but the same people who created Cambridge Analytica joined us, PECs, and they're doing exactly the same. Our data being collected without our knowledge, without our consent. We don't know who has profiles about us. We don't even have the right to be forgotten, like contacting these data brokers and say, remove my data. And the worst part of this whole thing is there are no regulation. It's an unregulated industry. So they get away with it, not only collecting it and using it.
It's absolutely crazy. I mean, Manal, you've also mentioned the lack of transparency in Australia in terms of how much social media is paid by mega industries.
Yes.
In particular, say even like the oil and gas industry to change people's, perspectives using targeted ads. I mean, how does Australia compare to other countries?
So we received a report from Influence Map, and the report was mentioning how much fossil fuel companies in the US paid Facebook to target certain group of people. They paid them, and I'm going to read from my notes, $9 million was paid. And the advertising, it shows that fossil fuel companies are part of the solution to the climate crisis. So they are greenwashing them using targeted ads and using platforms like Facebook. 48% of these ads highlighted that they are part of the solution. It's been viewed 122 million times by younger users between the age 25, 30, 40 years old. In Australia, we couldn't have access to this data. We understood that in the US, they are using Facebook to change people's perception of fossil fuel companies. We couldn't access this in Australia, which is a country that most of its revenue comes from fossil fuel. And for me, this is really disturbing because we can't, if there's no awareness of how they manipulate people's perception, we're just extending, there will be no climate policy. We will still extend the use of fossil fuel in Australia if we don't have access to this data.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so what is in store for people's future? I mean, if they have all this information and they can correlate that, what does that mean? What does that mean to our liberty, to our ability to think for ourselves, or the fact that we're being so influenced in so many ways?
Living in dictatorship is very clear, Rita. It's explicit that you've been manipulated, you've been gagged, you can't speak up, you read the news and you don't trust it because it's all controlled by one person. But living in democracies, this is the scary part because it's a soft oppression. You don't realize that you've been manipulated. You don't realize that these platforms, they understand, they have so much, they call it the persuasive technology.
Yeah.
So there are thousands of engineers sitting on the other side of my laptop, understand my personality and write messages to manipulate me and make me think this is actually my thoughts. These are my thoughts. I reached this conclusion by my own freedom of thinking. And that's completely misleading today, because once you go online and once you're facing a machine that understands you very well and knows what makes you tick and knows your psychological vulnerability and knows what makes you be engaged politically and who you're going to vote for, they can even influence that. There's no freedom of choice and freedom of thinking anymore, because before, editors in newsrooms can say this is very important for the people of this country to know about the government, and they hold them accountable.
Yeah.
Today, that is gone. We don't have that power anymore for journalism and for media. That's either our media controlled by two big Murdoch media and the News Corp media in Australia, like you have two big controlling the whole media in the country, or you go online and it's controlled by sensational, by people just posting things that are completely misinformation and create those, as I mentioned, filter bubble. So you're not thinking for yourself anymore. You're not finding the truth anymore. Instead of this avalanche of misinformation that we find online, it's so difficult today. to make sure that you're not influenced by someone else's thoughts. And that's what it's doing to us today. And that's why it's so important we know that we've been manipulated, we've been hijacked, our freedom of thinking, and people being shut down when the whistleblowers, when they try to mention that, by the way, these are not your thoughts, these are not your opinions.
So before we move into sort of state surveillance and Pegasus, which you've written about, can we just talk a little bit about, what it's really like to live under an authoritarian regime? I think that, in Australia, we're so blasé and just completely unreally aware of what does it feel like to be under an authoritarian regime when your rights are so fundamentally limited?
It's interesting if I tell you, Rita, growing up, I didn't know I was living under authoritarian regime. I didn't know. You just live and see everyone around you living the way they are, and you think this is life. You didn't realize until the internet, when it came to Saudi Arabia. I studied computer science, and this is how I got access to the internet early in '98. It was finally my questions had answers, because I grew up in a society where there are ready answers, you don't question. And this is the only truth, and there's nothing else but this. So that's, I think, the internet, this is why I believe in the power of technology. The internet is a tool for liberty, for people living in authority. Like, oh my God, I'm living in this system. I didn't even realize I was living under this system. And that's the I think the shocking part of living in dictatorships. Most of the times you don't know you're living in dictatorship. Most of the times you think this is the best way of living, and you feel bad for other people. So because they should live the life the way we are. Until
so what awakened you to that?
It was the internet. It was tech. It was tech, and tech, because there was heavy censorship from the government on books and freedom of thought in Saudi Arabia. I was a curious person that I want to know the truth. Like, I want to know not only facts given to me and fit to me. I wanted to question these things. I wanted to know if there are other truth to the same thing I believe in. You have to be a very curious person to find the truth today. But in living in a dictatorship, you also have to be a courageous person, because everyone around you believe in one thing, and that gives it the power. And they question you, like, why are you questioning this? I think the internet was the best, and social media with the Arab Spring in 2011 was the best thing that happened to us living under authoritarian regime, because you finally find people who think like you. You always thought it's only me thinking this way. Yeah. And that fear breaks of expressing your point of views, expressing your thoughts. And I think social media gave us that podium, that virtual parliament that we didn't have in dictatorships or authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to bring it back to Pegasus, because you've been writing a little bit about that. I've just put a link in to your Tech for Evil podcast. Can we just talk a little bit about, now we're just going to move to surveillance capitalism. I mean, to state surveillance, from surveillance capitalism to state surveillance.
So Pegasus, I call it intelligence as a service. So the Arab Spring didn't fail. The Arab dictators didn't make it on their own. Unfortunately, they made it with the help of Western intelligence. And tools like Pegasus, that was sold by NSO Group, which is an Israeli company, intelligence company, helped in hunting, finding those activists, hunting them, intimidating them, hacking their phones. Pegasus is just one example that I'm very thankful. We've been talking about it as activists for years. My friend, when she came out of jail, she's in the movement, the Women to Drive movement. She texted me on WhatsApp. We usually use Wicker or Signal to talk, or Telegram, any one of the secure ones. And I was like, no, don't talk to me here. Talk to me on one of the encrypted channels that we use. And she said, they can read all your messages on your phone as if they are shoulder surfing. There's no encrypted channel that can stop them. And she meant the government. And I was confused. That was 2018. Like, how can the government do that? And apparently Pegasus is a zero-click tool. That means they give you a missed call on your WhatsApp and you get infected. You didn't even need to click on a link to get infected. Once you get infected, they use a vulnerability on your iPhone, and they only target iPhone. Most of activists use iPhone because it's private. It's way better than Android. I trust iPhone more than Android. And they have access to everything you do on your phone, including your camera, your microphone, your messages. And they were building all these cases against human rights activists in Saudi Arabia using Pegasus. Pegasus was used to hack Jeff Bezos' personal phone.
Yeah.
It was used when I'm very thankful for Amnesty and Forbidden Stories. They found 55,000 numbers leaked for clients using Pegasus against these numbers. And when they investigated these numbers, a lot of them were journalists, human rights activists, head of governments, including the head of France, of the French government. That was huge. Like, been used by Morocco, by Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Emirates to target these people. So this tool would not be available for dictatorships if it wasn't sold for them and unchecked what they're going to use it for. There is a good documentary called Weapons of Mass Surveillance, and that's a BBC documentary. I was interviewed for that one. And they talked about BAE System, which is a British company, it's a British intelligence company. And they sell high surveillance, mass surveillance tools to governments like Saudi Arabian governments and the UAE. Unchecked, there should be questions for technology of mass destruction, exactly as we check arms of mass destruction being sold to dictatorships. We don't see the effect because it's not killing people. We don't see blood on the TV and we get horrified, but it is affecting people. It is putting people in jail. Pegasus was used to put an Emirati activist, Ahmed Mansour. We call him the $1 million activist because that Pegasus cost $1 million to infect a phone. $1 million. They're willing to pay $1 million to shut down people and freedom of speech in these countries. He's in jail today for 10 years. He is sentenced in jail, and they use Pegasus effectively, and it was Citizen Lab. They confirmed that he was hacked by Pegasus.
Well, this is the kind of future that unfortunately in Australia we are heading towards with the introduction last week of the Surveillance Legislation Amendment Identity and Disrupt Bill 2020. Now, who decided that we down under would become a legitimate surveillance state? Angus, let's talk a little bit about the history of the bill and where we're at right now.
Unfortunately, we did, Greta, which is squarely in line with what Manal was saying about the difficulties in democracy. We elect people on the basis that we consider that they are capable of responsibly representing the community, and the way that we elect those people is based on election campaigning. And unfortunately, there has been large-scale examples here in the US and in the UK most notably, where targeted advertising has been used to manipulate election campaigns, which fundamentally underpins our democracy and the way that we choose to be governed by a group of people who are intended to be responsible and representative in the way that that governance occurs. The Identify and Disrupt Bill, which became an act last Wednesday, is only one in a series of developments that have happened in Australia, largely in a reaction to the events on 9/11, but a very rapid expansion has happened over the last 5 years. I've spoken about this quite a few times in the past, so I'll only very briefly brush on the progression that's effectively happened in Australia. Since 2013, with the introduction of the mandatory metadata retention scheme, which came into force in 2015, government has the ability to have warrantless access to telecommunications data about data, being metadata, other than where journalistic information is involved. And theoretically, the government's required to get a warrant when a journalist is involved, although we've seen a number of occasions in Australia where the Australian Federal Police have conveniently forgotten that that warrant requirement exists. That was only traffic data and information about information that was being held by telecommunications companies. We've got much, much more intrusive power since then, notably the 2018 Assistance and Access Act, which allows effectively government to require and have authorised at a very low level the ability to have technical assistance and technical capabilities built into technology. One of my concerns with that is it was, the starting point of that was a war on maths declared in 2016, which is an absurd concept and a sentiment that should really concern all Australians for a variety of reasons, not the least because it just bespeaks the complete ignorance of government and the people who are making decisions about our electronic freedoms. To say something like a war on maths can be declared, it's as ridiculous as a war on drugs or a war on terror. It's a war on an idea that can never be won. So it's effectively the self-propagating and self-fulfilling war that has no end. The assistance and access legislation, in my view, effectively destroys encryption and the benefit of encryption. And I say that because I might communicate with Manal and Signal, for example. I wouldn't even bother attempting to crack the encryption if I have the ability to force screenshots at the start point or end point of the communication where it's in plain text rather than in ciphertext in the middle. So we led that one through in Australia. And then more recently, we've had a couple of bills. The technical capability, the biometric facial recognition capability was introduced into Australia, passed in a number of states, has yet to pass it in a federal level, and that allows biometric facial recognition to occur and the sharing of identity information between Australians. I'll come back to facial information in a moment. The Identify and Disrupt bill, which became an act last week, is only the latest in a fairly large suite of surveillance law developments in Australia. And I put it in that context because if it was just an act in its own right and alone, it may not be as scary as when you see the full picture of the power that we've given to law enforcement. Yeah. That picture becomes more scary when you think the controlling minds or the agencies and bodies that have the ability to wield these powers is extremely insulated. It all falls within the Home Affairs mega portfolio, which I have a deep concern about, because the ability to pierce into that ministry and to understand what and how that ministry is actually operating on becomes more difficult when it's effectively a power unto itself that rivals the power of the Prime Minister in terms of the power that agency now has. The Identify and Disrupt legislation was very rapidly passed. I have a number of very deep criticisms about that legislation, as I did with each of the previous bills that became acts that I've mentioned. Predominantly, that was introduced on the back of the bill was introduced by Peter Dutton, the Minister for Home Affairs. And when it was introduced, it was immediately referred to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security with an extremely tight reporting deadline, with the direct sentiment that this will pass in the 2021 August sittings of Parliament. So it had a preordained future and outcome before it had been scrutinised. And I think that couldn't be considered to be a person responsibly or representatively sitting for the interests of Australia to do or say that. That it went through the Parliamentary Joint Committee is useful, and we put a very extensive submission in alongside the Queensland Council for Civil Liberties, Liberty Victoria and the Australian Privacy Foundation that made a number of recommendations. The first recommendation being our long-standing recommendation that the bill should not pass and no legislation of a surveillance nature should be introduced until an enforceable human rights framework is introduced at a federal level in Australia. And that's noteworthy because we are the only Western democratic country that does not have enforceable human rights at a federal level. And that's important for everyone because the courts are effectively our check and balance. If the check and balance of our responsible elected people operating in a representative way fails. So that we don't have that puts us at a weaker position than the rest of the world.
So it's like the Identity and Disrupt bill is kind of like the icing on the cake that then allows the enabling of that whole architectural system to actually come into full force.
I'd say it's the very, very pretty fondant around a rotting cake that's been off for quite a while. The Identify and Disrupt legislation effectively allows government to hack, is authorised to hack people with account takeover warrants, network activity monitoring warrants, and data disruption warrants for an incredibly low threshold of criminal offence that's got a maximum of 3 years imprisonment and has a federal element attached to it. So a very, very low threshold. And I say the cake.
And as Manal has mentioned as well, that, you know, it is the journalists, the human rights activists, the people that are making a bit of noise are the ones that, you know, are targeted by this. And we know that's happening in Australia too. And I know that a lot of people are really, really worried about the fact that all their information is on social media. They've got a whole history of their views and what they've been saying. I mean, we can look at China, for instance. At the moment, they're trolling through all the social media to find people who've been making negative statements about the Chinese economic policies. And so it's getting to this point of extremism now. We're at this point where people are concerned. I can't trust who's talking to me on social media. I can't trust to be doing any type of dissent. We don't know who's emailing us. Is it a trick? We're not going to know. So what happens to our society once this, I mean, it's also some of the points like Martin has also been making in the chat, is that people aren't concerned enough even about Apple and all these sorts of things that are going on. So when people do start to realize what is happening, what do we do? Because we can't trust technology anymore.
It's a really, really important question, and I'll grab that very quickly. So a concern that I have is legislation just legitimizes what's being done by government. And the Pegasus tool was used under the auspices of it's to combat terror and to help prevent crime, yet it's weaponized against human rights activists. The Identify and Disrupt legislation just enables that to happen at a lawful or on a lawful basis, and that's a really concerning thing. In terms of,
they use these tools against what they see as a threat, and a threat is a very broad blanket. You're not a terrorist, but you're a threat to them. So that's the wide.
Which is incredibly concerning, because democracy, and in my view, society generally, whether it's a democracy or some other creature of governance, is enhanced by a dissenting view and the ability to have a robust discussion about something, even if it's unpalatable. And it becomes incredibly dangerous when you have gatekeepers of information and the economic basis behind the altering of information. We're seeing a couple of these checks and balances happening around the world. As recently as Friday last week, the Illinois courts considered that Clearview AI, which captured billions of billions of faces across social media, was bound by the Biometric and Information Privacy Act, and that the court has jurisdiction to hear whether an application made by civil society organisations will have teeth and will end up with Clearview AI being adversely impacted. And that's important, because that is as Manal very, very appropriately said, these are the umpires in the shadows that are allowing these things to happen. And that's a context that everyone should be aware of. My concern for the future, Rita, to go to your question, is there's an interaction and a bargain of trust with everything. We're seeing a situation where I think people are becoming less trustworthy or less trusting of technology. And technology, because of these legislative powers, is inherently becoming less trustworthy to the consumers. So you have trust breaking down on both sides. I can't trust technology, and technology can't trust me. It starts to unwind. And then we really see misinformation and disinformation getting its teeth in. The best thing I think that we can do for the future is to have conversations, even if they're difficult conversations, and to understand, even if this doesn't affect me now, and I have not once argued the government now is oppressing Australians in a direct or totalitarian sense. What the government is doing is opening the gate and tiptoeing along the edge of the line that could very easily be passed. And that's the concern we should have. So if you don't care about yourself, you should care about your children or your friends' children or the future of the country that we all love and share together.
Yeah, and I guess it's also the point of view of actually just seeing, like what is it that we're seeing? So I'm going to put this out to Manal and you, Angus, as well. So obviously, companies like Google and Facebook, we know that Google at the moment is entrenched in like education, government, health, commerce, private sector. It's entrenched in absolutely everything. And as Manal has been saying, that they are truly evil, right? So how do we move forward? Google and Facebook, their headquarters are based in another country. So we're kind of powerless to sort of really engage this. So what's the way forward? Is it more focusing on the government? What do you think, Angus?
I'll just because you directed it to me, I'll jump in first, but very quickly, because I'm sure Manal has very insightful things to say about this. The first aspect of this is I am always concerned to make the point about capitalism and the evils of capitalism. So anything good that Google is doing, and Google does do good things, it gives access to information. It's a platform. It started in 2006 benevolently, like most things do. The evil that sits behind this is it is now doing good to shield itself from the bad that it's doing in the back, and that's simply so shareholders continue to make profit. And that's the reality of the situation. The criticism is really in the flow of money that's falling into private hands. There are things that we can do. We can lobby for a federal human rights framework in Australia. There have been some attempts in Australia to wrap in Google. I think that the recent thing about geolocation tracking data through the Australian Consumer Competition Commission was a positive step. Realistically, I think that was a facade to something else. I think that was a way that the ACCC was extracting revenue from Google rather than it being truly about privacy of individuals. And what we need to do in Australia is think about what the consequence of this is on the future. Because I think that the importance we have as humans functioning in a digital society is that we evolve in a way that we want to evolve, not something where we are evolved by technology. And I think thinking about it in that context is a little bit more appropriate than whether the government's right or whether technology is right or whether corporations are right. It's what we want as autonomous human beings, and bringing humans back to the front of the conversation, I think, is important, and having that conversation.
Rita, in 2012, I had dinner with Sergey Brin himself. He attended one of my speeches in Human Rights Foundation, and he was actually sponsoring that event. And I sat next to him, and the first thing he told me, we found a solution. We already have a solution for your problem in Saudi Arabia. Women are not allowed to drive. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, we are inventing the self-driving car. And by the way, it was invented here in Sydney. And I don't see them as evil and at the start. But the problem is, at the start, they were serving their users, people who use this technology. Now that changed. What we want, our agenda and their agenda are different. They're now serving their shareholders. And that makes them just follow what shareholders want. And even if, and I know Google were against monetizing the data they were sitting on. I know this for a fact. Like, I read the history of Google, and I love the amazing things they've done for the world. It just, now things really shifted. And when it's enough for them to, like, they are so big to fail. There's a whole now antitrust. The Congress in the US are going for the antitrust because they said those are monopolies today and has to be broken up. So when it went unchecked, and technology usually is way faster than government and bureaucracy. So they are running fast. Regulators and policymakers, they barely can catch up after the damage already done. And that's why they went unchecked and unregulated. And if they can get away with it, they'll get away with it. And that's what happened with Google and Facebook today. So I don't see them as pure evil. For me, Facebook is pure evil. That's it. I have no other thoughts about Facebook. But Google, I've seen the good in Google, and I've seen how they started, and I've seen the amazing thing they did to the world. But when our interest is completely changed from serving people, using this data to make better products, to using this data to hijack people's minds, to wage a psychological warfare in the form of digital advertising. This is the one that really made it evil. I really hope, and I mentioned this many times, that I hope that ethics is being introduced to technology. I'm a computer scientist by education. We didn't study ethics. We program. There is a human being sitting on the other side of my program, but we are disconnected. We just write in a way that those technologists, all they care for is the race to attention. How much time of your time? So they go to our amygdala brain, the lizard brain, and they manipulate that lizard brain to make their technology addictive, because it's not enough for them to use their tech. They want us to crave for their tech more than we crave for drugs. So because there was no line for them, there were no ethics taught for them.
It's just rampant greed, isn't it?
Yes.
It's complete, absolute greed. So we have a question here. So what do the panel think about the alternative of non-Google, non-Apple phones like Purinism, Librem 5 and Pine 64? I'm reminded, though, of Anna Funder's observation in Stasiland that a few people managed to dig tunnels under the Berlin Wall, but things changed for people at large only when the wall came down. And just following up to that, related to this are the free software interaction platforms. I guess that is one of the things a lot of people are saying about the sort of, open source, but obviously it's very, very difficult and it's very hard to get the people with the skills. But let's have a little bit of a conversation about that, because I know that I've talked to a lot of people in industry, and it's very hard to push forward really good technology when you're competing with Google, with free software.
Yeah, Google, they make sure they kill their competitors. You're not competing with Google. Google and Facebook crush their competitors, and that kills innovation. So there are no more innovation. Silicon Valley, they put the innovation on hold. And I'll just give a small example. In Europe, they passed a law just to standardize the charger cable. Everyone should use USB-C.
Yep.
Apple went banana because they make a lot of money from their accessories, not selling their products like the earpod, and they went banana on this Apple. So what they do, not only the lobbyist, not only killing competition, the monopoly they have is also unfair monopoly. Yeah. Today, capitalism is unconscious capitalism. It's not the capitalism that we started with 50 years ago, because it went unchecked and uncriticized for 50 years in fear of socialists and communists. So to answer the question, unfortunately, it's that there's not anymore. I feel like, I don't want to sound bleak and we lost the battle, but I think it starts with awareness that people need to know what's happening behind the scene. We need to know what big tech doesn't want us to know. I think it starts from that awareness. Me living in a dictatorship, I didn't know better. I thought we were living in a happy country and everything is fine. And I felt something is wrong the whole time, like why I wasn't allowed to do a lot of things being a woman. Why I had to cover my face fully. And I covered my face for 28 years because I didn't know better. I didn't know other things existed out there. And I think technology that we don't know better, like we didn't know what's happening today with this tech. Yeah, I'm still hopeful. Like I still hope that with people being aware and pushing back and taking their power back, things will be pushed in the right directions. And by the way, Google are removing support for cookies, for example, which is a way of surveillance that supports surveillance capitalism.
So, I mean,
very quickly, Rita, if I can just jump on that question as well, because it's very interesting. There's two directions that I just wanted to touch on, which align, I think, with Manal. The first is, I think an appropriate way of framing and looking at this is what is convenient. So a lot of this is, I give up rights, but it's convenient because I have a phone that I can buy and I can do these things and I can communicate. Think about the word convenient. It's more convenient for the people selling things to you and for the government wanting to know where you are, or for others that want an interest into your life, than it is for you. So convenience as a justification, I think, is inherently flawed. And I think that's an important conversation for people to start having.
Yes, yes.
The second is, I had the advantage of studying law in Australia and then moving to Sweden and studying law in Sweden. And part of the reason I did that was I wanted to look at what Australia does from the outside. And the advantage of that is I see the benefits of Australian law, and I can also see some issues with Australian law. And the way of thinking in Australia is also different to the way of thinking elsewhere in the world. One of the incredibly valuable thought experiments that I was taken through while studying at Stockholm University in Sweden, and that was a Masters of Intellectual Property Law, was the concept of anti-intellectual property. And the idea there is, if you abolish all of the intellectual property regimes, everything becomes free domain. What happens? And the conclusion that came to in the class is human greed creates intellectual property because there is a desire to create monopolies around one's ideas, one's thoughts, or the way that the person achieves a benefit over others. That's unfortunately a part of the human condition that capitalism grabs onto and really, really ramps up. And that's what we've seen over the last 50 years, as Manal had said. Unfortunately, I think the alternative of non-Google, non-Apple will just end up with a new Google, but not called Google. And it's more a, let's think about why we're doing technology rather than what technology we're using. And then that convenience discussion comes back.
We can still use, I would stay away from Android, like even from cybersecurity perspective, I never recommend Android. You can go to Apple, just make sure you don't, for example, use their iCloud, because now they're going to have access to your photos in iCloud, just save them somewhere else. Make sure that they introduce good things like the privacy report when you download an app. They tell you what type of information they track you. They tell you when an app is tracking you and they block it. Their Safari is amazing. Like it's very private browser where it blocks all tracking and cookies. So I would use it and be careful. Like I would make tech work for me. Like turn off that for example, the screen time, because they track you and it's sent to somewhere. You only see 7 days report. You don't know what happened to the last year report. I would turn off that. But it shares, Android shares data with Google 10 times more than Apple. Android shares your location with Google every 3 minutes, and that's a research that was done. I don't trust Android. And by the way, Android is a copy paste from Apple. They stole it. Eric Schmidt stole Apple, moved it to Google. So unfortunately, this whole Silicon Valley, there are all these backstabbing. I would use it, but turn off things like your location. Make sure that all your privacy settings is right. And in the blog, I talk about the good hygiene for your privacy setting. But the problem is not using these phones, because even if you're not using these phones, let's say I'm not using Apple, non-Google, your telecommunication company has towers all over the place. When you come near that tower and your phone pings to it, they know your precise geolocation, and they sell that data. Go to Telstra, whatever company that you have here using in Australia, read the privacy policy. They share your data with third party. So even if you change your phone, those data brokers, they will have ways to find more information about you, even from your credit card purchases. They will have data. It's everywhere, actually.
It's crazy.
The only solution for me is really it has to be regulated. People need to know when their data is being collected and processed. They need to know that.
So just quickly, Manal, Angus kind of went over a lot of the legislations and the laws and really showed the framework of how this kind of surveillance state is actually it's sort of engulfing us here right now in Australia. And it is it's a cause of concern. But I would have to ask you, Manal, did you ever imagine that this could actually happen in Australia?
When I came to Australia, I found people complacent. And I didn't understand the complacency, like why they don't, like with the refugees problem. When I came, the first thing when I Googled, it was the refugee problem, and now silent. I couldn't believe it. This is a democracy. This is happening. Why people are not talking about it? And that really shocked me when I first came to Australia. Like there's something off here. What's going on? Why people are not speaking up about these violations, human rights violations in Australia, in a democracy? And apparently because the media here is controlled by few people, there are monopolies. And they made sure that anyone who speaks up, character assassination. And that happens in dictatorships, where they character assassinate you. So they create that sense of fear where everyone is complacent. They self-censor. This could get me in trouble. I can't speak up about it. And that was the first thing that shocked me when I came to Australia, the state of self-censorship in Australia, the complacency. And I think Kevin Rudd had the diversity of media. I was following his speech and I'm like, oh my God, it makes sense when I was listening to his speech. And he was giving all these statistics of how all local news was killed and it's been monopoly. News for me and media are the one that makes people take informed decisions. People are busy. People don't have time to go and look for the truth. And the media are the people who are entrusted with telling us the truth, with telling us what's happening. What should I care about today in Australia? And that's been manipulated, and that's being controlled by a few hands. And that scares me. In democracies, if you want a healthy, functioning democracy, you want very strong media that holds people in the government accountable for their actions. And I don't see that here.
Yeah. So obviously there's a lot of things that we need to be doing. We need to put pressure on the government to rein in that behaviour of those corporations. And in fact, I think we're paying for the price of decades of failure from the government to actually regulate this behaviour. And the alliance between big corporations and government excludes us, excludes civil society, excludes your ordinary Australians. So I think it's really important that everyone has to sort of get in touch with their MPs and actually become really active, so that what we're talking about today isn't going to actually turn into a full-blown surveillance state. Talk to your friends, write letters to editors, become involved in lobbying. Join EFA, please become a member, get involved. We'd love more people to join, and also donate. Please donate to EFA. We really need money to come in to actually keep this going. So really looking for people out there to actually make some donations. Now, before we wrap up, Angus, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Just wanted to make the point to everyone in terms of what government's doing in contacting MPs. The Liberal government in the late 90s took the goods and services tax to a federal election on the basis that it was going to so substantially change the way that Australians interact with each other, and a revenue consequence that flows from that, that it warranted the Australian community voting for a party that was proposing to introduce such a radical change to Australian law. Why that hasn't happened with the assistance and access legislation or with the identify and disrupt legislation, which have the equal potential of changing the way we interact in our society and the way that we trust and observe each other in a transactional sense, I think really warrants pausing for thought. And if you put that in the context of a government that chose to deliberately introduce it rapidly and pass it in the shadows as a preordained series of steps that would be taken to end up with the bills passing, as has the last 5 pieces of surveillance legislation in Australia occurred, all within the same government. I think we as Australia deserve better than a government like that. And I think we as Australia need to do more and stand up and start talking about this more actively. And I agree with Manal that there's a culture of apathy in Australia. I think now is the point that Australians need to start talking more broadly about these issues. And surveillance legislation is only one of a myriad of things that fall within the context of human rights that Australians should be demanding at the next election be changed, and that there be clear mandates put on government about how those changes occur.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to say a big thank you to our panelists. Manal, al-Sharif, it is such a pleasure and so inspiring to talk to you. Angus, you are just our legend here. We are so grateful to the amount of work that you do, and your passion in digital rights is just astounding. And I'm really enjoying doing these EFA talks with you. And also a big thank you again to ThoughtWorks, who make this happen, and Robin. Now, if you're not a member, as I said before, please join us. Check out our website, efa.org.au. We are an independent, non-for-profit association that relies on membership, subscriptions, and donations. So if you're concerned about digital rights, please join or donate. Also, if you have any comments or topics of interest, please get in contact with us through our website, and we would really love to hear from you. Thank you all for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.